Let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material. We're looking at a detailed breakdown of a prominent speech by an Islamic scholar, and it lays out a highly specific historical framework. The core idea? How religious unity and, on the flip side, religious division actually shapes massive historical and political outcomes. It's honestly a masterclass in political rhetoric. The speaker weaves together history, theology, and modern politics in a way that's totally captivating. By breaking this down, we're going to see exactly how historical narratives are actively crafted to influence people today. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the power of scholar unity. Then we dive into a case study on the Afghan War, followed by the cost of disunity, another case study on Iran's resistance, and finally, how all this applies to the contexts of Pakistan and Bangladesh. All right, part 1, the power of scholar unity. So the foundation of the speaker's whole argument is the absolute non-negotiable need for unity among religious scholars if you want any sort of political or military success. In the framework of this speech, historical victories, even going all the way back to expelling the British, are directly tied to moments when religious leaders just put their differences aside and stood together. The dynamic here revolves around two main concepts. The speaker argues that the relationship between the ulama, the Islamic scholars, is literally the deciding factor in regional conflicts. When they're united, unstoppable. But when they divide, they fall into what the speaker calls fatwabazi. This is essentially the practice of weaponizing religious edicts, or fatwas, against rival scholars, basically tearing their own community apart from the inside out. Moving on to part 2, case study Afghan War. To really prove this point, the lecture points to the Afghan-Soviet War. The speaker spends a good chunk of time on this because, well, it's the perfect dramatic backdrop to show that extreme swing from bitter division to powerful unity. And the way he does it is so interesting. He uses these vivid, folksy metaphors to frame the Afghan resistance as this massive, almost impossible underdog. On one hand, he compares the Afghan fighters to a newborn infant holding ancient, wet guns from the era of Noah's Ark. And on the other, the Soviet forces are described as a giant monster armed to the teeth with modern weapons. This stark contrast is totally intentional. It makes the eventual Afghan victory seem miraculous, and it's a miracle he attributes entirely to unity. But before that victory, the speaker humorously, and pretty critically, points out that the ulama were severely divided by extreme fatwabazi. The infighting was just staggering. You had rival scholars excommunicating each other, calling each other non-believers for 5, 3, or even 17 different arbitrary reasons. They wouldn't look at each other, wouldn't return a greeting. It got so absurd, the speaker notes, that they even condemned a cow as a non-believer just because it happened to eat grass from a rival scholar's grave. I mean, wow. And that absurdity sets up a brilliant turning point. When the war kicked off, everyone had to flee to the mountains and jungles. The lecture uses this super relatable family metaphor. A guy says his sons fled to their uncles, his daughters went to their grandfathers, his wife to her father's, and he to his father-in-law's, only to realize they literally all ended up in the exact same jungle hideout. Boom. Suddenly, all these fiercely divided scholars are stuck in the same place. They had no choice but to embrace and unite, realizing that if they'd just done this earlier, the invasion might never have happened in the first place. Which brings us to part 3, the cost of disunity. Okay, so if unity brings victory, what happens when you go back to being divided? The timeline of these events perfectly captures the cyclical nature of his argument. Phase 3 shows us that 9 years of wartime unity let them defeat a superpower. But look at Phase 4. Post-victory, the Mujahideen and scholars fell right back into their old habits: division, distrust, suspicion. They stopped greeting each other all over again. And according to the speaker, this renewed disunity wiped out their progress and paved the exact path for Phase 5, the U.S. invasion, leading the country right back into the hands of a foreign power. Next up, Part 4, Case Study Iran's Resistance. Crossing borders over to Iran, the lecture makes a really fascinating pivot. The speaker explicitly acknowledges that there are major differences in aqidah, or core religious beliefs, between his own tradition and the Iranians. But his argument? It didn't matter. The absolute unity of the Iranian Ayatollahs is what allowed them to successfully push back against American influence and establish their state. The takeaway here is that pragmatic unity against a powerful, common adversary will always supersede internal ideological differences. To really hammer home this ideological resilience, the speaker tells a famous story about Ayatollah Khomeini. During the hostage crisis, the American president allegedly threatened to cut off all food supplies. Khomeini's reported response was incredibly defiant. He basically said, "You threaten a nation with starvation when fasting for a month is obligatory?" He declared they simply didn't care about the food of non-believers. The speaker uses this anecdote to showcase the immense psychological boldness that comes from a completely unified religious leadership. Finally, Part 5, Pakistan and Bangladesh contexts. Shifting from grand history right into contemporary politics, the speaker points to a modern application of his thesis right in Pakistan. He notes how scholars from totally different sects united to form a coalition called the Muttahida Majlis-e-Amal, or MMA. By bringing all these rival factions under one banner, they pulled off an electoral victory that shocked the world. For the speaker, this is undeniable proof that the unity equals victory formula still works perfectly today. But then, looking at Bangladesh, the tone changes dramatically. Here, the speaker details claims regarding the previous local government, alleging that they treated religious scholars as mortal enemies. He describes severe oppression and hostility against the ulema. The narrative here firmly positions the scholars as victims of a domestic adversary, which implicitly suggests that the only way to overcome this alleged oppression is through the exact same kind of unity we saw in the Afghan and Pakistani examples. To drive home just how deep this alleged hostility ran, the speaker drops a highly provocative example. He cites a local poet who reportedly compared the Fajr, the dawn call to prayer, to a prostitute calling her customers. By quoting something so intentionally shocking, the speaker is emphasizing the intense level of cultural disrespect he claims the ulama faced. It is a powerful rhetorical device, very clearly meant to stir deep emotion and a sense of urgency among his listeners. And that brings us to the end of this analysis. We've seen how the speaker masterfully weaves these tales, from grazing cows to mountain hideouts and defiant world leaders, all to push one powerful message. But the real takeaway from this explainer is recognizing the mechanics of the rhetoric itself. I want you to think about this. How are deeply emotional, historical case studies utilized as rhetorical tools to shape modern political action today? Because when leaders tell us stories about the past, they are almost always trying to organize us for the future. Thanks for tuning into this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the narratives around you.